Okay, we're going to get started. Thanks all for being here. Our first event to kick off the 2015-16 academic year at the Center on Global Energy Policy. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, and I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy. In the spring, after the first oil price collapse before it rose and has since fallen again, we at the Energy Center undertook to reach out to different regional experts with expertise in economic and political situations in key oil exporters, also along with being energy experts, to try to assess what the impact of this sharp decline, his really historic collapse relative to the other large collapses in the oil price we saw in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, what impact that would have on some of the largest oil exporters most dependent on oil revenue for their budgets. Since then, we've released studies looking at Iran by Richard Nephew, a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy, looking at Mexico by Adrian Lejeune, who's also a fellow at the center and the former CEO of Pemex. And the next in the series is the study that we have released today. You'll see a presentation of it here. The study is now available on our website at energypolicy.columbia.edu. And it's by Francisco Monaldi, many of you know, who's a Baker Institute Fellow in Latin American Energy Policy and Adjunct Professor of Energy Economics at Rice University, also affiliated with the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, as well as IESA in Caracas, Venezuela, and the founding director of IESA Center on Energy and the Environment, and one of the most well-respected analysts and experts and academics out there looking at energy economics in Latin America. And really delighted that he was able to join us today and that he was willing to produce this report for us, looking at the current state of production, economics, and the political situation in Venezuela. So he's going to present the results of his study, and then we're going to have a brief panel conversation up here about the study and put it in the context also of what's happening more broadly in global energy markets, and I'll introduce the panelists when we all stand up afterwards. People may be watching online, and you can participate as well, ask your questions via Twitter through the hashtag CGEP, Center Global Energy Policy, CGEP Events, and follow us on Twitter at Columbia U Energy. So with that, thank you all for being here, and let me please turn over to Professor Monaldi. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here at Columbia. Nice room. And as Jason mentioned, this is sort of a brief paper trying to sort of give an overview of what's happening in Venezuela after the oil price collapse, looking at both sort of the economics, the politics, but mostly focusing on the oil industry itself, which of course is sort of the base for everything else in the country. So let me start a little bit putting things into perspective. I mean, Venezuela received the largest windfall of any country in Latin America during the last, the decade just before last year. And to put it in perspective, it was about 304% of GDP in terms of the size of the economy. To give you an idea, sort of that's close to the percentage that you will find in the countries in the GCC as a percentage of their size of their economies, which are, of course, larger than Venezuela. I mean, at least Saudi, but per capita larger too. But that gives you an idea of sort of the amazing size of this windfall. And that contrasts tremendously with the very poor performance in terms of the economics. As you can see there, Venezuela had the slowest rate of growth of almost any country in the region. I mean, if you put sort of the smaller countries, you will find that Haiti and a couple of other Central American countries are doing worse than Venezuela if you include sort of depending on which years you include. But in some years, you only Haiti it's doing worse than Venezuela, which is really amazing. In terms of inflation, of course, today Venezuela has the highest rate of inflation in the world, but even if you look at sort of the whole period, Venezuela was an outlier, a significant outlier in terms of inflation during this period. And if you do a similar comparison, but instead within the region, you look at countries, say in OPEC, or countries that had similar levels of windfall, Venezuela's performance is even worse in comparison. And moreover, Venezuela, compared to other countries that are oil dependent, was a striking case of not learning, from the previous experience. So most other oil dependent countries in this cycle, in this high oil price cycle, invested more, saved more, and paid debt. This was not the case of Venezuela. This is I call it sort of a version on steroids of what Venezuela did in the 70s. And as you can see, when the price of oil was at its peak, Venezuela was having deficits of 17% of GDP. In particular, the election year is a very significant one, 2012, because President Chavez was sick, and he sort of engineered a massive expansion during that year, a tremendous overvaluation of the exchange rate, a dramatic increase in imports, and all those distortions that were created in that year are sort of what we are sort of, compounded with the decline in the price of oil, were causing what we see today. And you can see there that the pattern, there is a discrete jump in 2012 in terms of deficits expanding. The other thing to keep in mind is that even though Venezuela had relatively very poor economic performance in terms of social indicators, it did pretty well for a while. Between 2004 and 2008, Venezuela had a very significant decrease in poverty, and in particular, an explosion in consumption per capita. And you can see that in real terms, consumption grew by about 60% during that period. And even though if you compare it to other countries in the region, the performance is not as stellar, particularly given that those other countries were not receiving such a large windfall, still that pretty much explains very well the popularity of President Chavez. And as you can see there is a very high correlation between the increase in real consumption and the popularity of the president. So Chavez's popularity went down during the adjustments after the financial crisis, but then he was able to go back up, as I mentioned, with the dramatic increase in consumption that he engineered. And of course, when we talk about Maduro, a big part of the explanation of the collapse in his popularity that we will see now has to do with that. And this is exactly what we see in this slide here. This is how do people evaluate how the country is doing in general terms. And as you can see, the red line is looking at a negative view outlook of the country, and the blue line is a positive one. And this is basically Maduro's tenure in power. And he started with about a majority thinking that the country was doing well, and right now it's close to 90% of the population think that the country is doing badly. And in terms of approval rating, Maduro's today has an approval rating that I still find significantly high if you compare to the previous slide, in the sense that it's 24% approval rating that contrasts with 10% of the population that thinks that things are doing well. But it's, of course, the highest level of negative approval. He had for a while in 2000 in this data analysis poll a slightly higher negative number, but this is a level that during the Chavismo has never been experienced. And that leads us to the elections. We have on December 6 legislative elections in Venezuela, and today the numbers look, if this was a normal country, it will be an obvious landslide victory for the opposition in December, because the opposition is basically leading 2-1 in voting intention. And even if you filter by I mean, the Chavismo is a little bit has a little bit higher degree of mobilization than not than the opposition that much, but as the sort of the non-aligned voters that are going to vote against the Chavismo in these elections. So if you filter for likely voters, you get a better number for the Chavismo. But still, the margin is huge. Of course, this is an election that it's not single-member district because a few are 2 or 3, but this is a sort of a majoritarian election in many of the circuits. So it's difficult to predict with a national poll what would happen, but everything points to a very significant victory by the opposition. And the question is, how will that be dealt with by the Chavismo? What would happen in terms of the credibility of the results, and how will a majority in the National Assembly by the opposition, what type of sort of a scenario will that lead to? So let's look at the oil industry and then sort of gather everything together. So first point to keep in mind, Venezuela is a country that is totally dependent on oil, much more dependent than even than some countries in the Middle East. And 96% of exports are oil today. Basically doesn't export anything else. But that sort of contrasts with the line that you see there, that the net oil exports in terms of volume, in terms of barrels, have been declining significantly for the past decade or so. So basically, the only thing allowing Venezuela for this consumption boom was the oil price boom, and now this dependence is becoming really troublesome. And so this is, I mean, this sort of cycle of decline of the Venezuelan oil industry, it sort of reminds you a little bit of what happened during the 70s, that basically, the country did not invest for very different reasons at the time. It was, the private companies were not being, concessions were not being renewed, and taxes were going up. And basically, Venezuela had a significant collapse in production in the early 70s due to lack of investment, then due to OPEC quotas. But then you see there was a big push of investment and production during the oil opening in the 90s, and Venezuela reached a production level that it's almost 1 million barrels more, or a little bit less than like 800 and something barrels. 1,000 barrels more than what it produces today. The dip there that you see in the early 2000s, of course, is the oil strike, and so, but the resource endowment of the country, it's amazing, and even though this is an issue that in which there is a lot of misinformation, because the Venezuelan government published official figures of oil reserves that are not very credible, in the sense that use a very high recovery rate from the Orinoco Belt that has never been achieved. But even if you sort of discount such numbers of recovery rates, Venezuela would have, instead of 300 billion barrels, say 170 or 180. So it will have reserves second to Saudi Arabia, close, very similar to the ones that Canada has in the tar sands. Similar to Canada, although the break-even cost of Venezuela are much lower than Canada, it's extra heavy oil, so it's a type of oil that it's has lower margins and it's costly to sort of transport and refine, etc. So even more so, if you consider how many years of reserves Venezuela has because of the low production. Remember that Venezuela has almost half the production of Canada, even though, as I said, conservatively has the same reserves of Canada, and officially has double the reserves of Canada or so. But Venezuela sort of has official the number of years of reserves at the current rate of production is 300 years. So, I mean, it might not mean too much because it's a number that it's sort of like infinity from the perspective of public policy. But I think it's good to keep in mind. So The other sort of things that are sort of trends that are problematic of Venezuela is not only the decline in the production itself and the net exports that we will see, but it's sort of the mix. The red and blue lines in the right hand side figure show the conventional oil in Venezuela. In the blue line is the Maracaibo Basin, and the red line is the northeastern conventional oil, where the most productive fields of the country are. And as you can see, particularly worrisome is because Lake of Maracaibo had been declining for years, and it has declined more than 1 million barrels in the last decade, in the last decade and a half. However, the case of the northeastern Venezuela, it's very problematic because these are the most productive fields of the country that were used to blend with the extra heavy and heavy oil. So those two trends are problematic, and then you can see that the only thing going up is the extra heavy oil in the Orinoco area of Venezuela. The other thing that you can see in the left-hand side is that the production done by PDVSA itself is declining even faster than the total production of Venezuela. So the JVs, the partnerships with foreign companies, are the only ones that are keeping sort of production from not falling faster. And so that is, of course, problematic in a variety of ways. First of all, because the cash flow of PDVSA it's much less from those projects than the one that they have from own operated projects. And particularly, you have to keep in mind that PDVSA didn't invite anyone to the easy, low-risk areas. So those are sort of lower margin, more complex fields are the ones who are increasing in production. And here you see the same thing. So you see the separate in between Orinoco JVs and conventional oil JVs. By the way, you will see both in the paper and here a combination of official figures from PDVSA. So if you see differences in figures, it's not that you are wrong. There are different figures because PDVSA has some figures and other secondary sources have slightly different figures with lower levels of production, for example. So let's look in a little bit more detail what is happening in the Orinoco Belt, in the extra heavy non-conventional oil. And you can see there that the existing projects have been slightly increasing production, but the new projects, and mind the scale, which is totally different, the new projects that were supposed to be producing at this point, about a million barrels or so, are producing about 40,000 barrels. And you can see the partners of these new projects there, Gazprom, Eni, CNPC, Chevron with the Japanese, and Repsol with the Indian national oil company. So this has been a disappointment in the sense that these projects have been delayed and have taken much longer than it was expected, but something is happening there. So there is the prospect of a potential continued increase in the Orinoco area. In terms of exports, so Venezuela's production is declining, net exports are declining, but the other problem is that a lot of the production, at least, is not paid for, in the sense that, of course, the domestic market is a cash drain, basically. We'll see that in another slide. But the other thing is the mix. Venezuela is exporting much less to the U.S., and you can see that in this decline in imports from Venezuela. And by the way, very recently there has been a slight increase, but which is for obvious pragmatic reasons to get more cash. And there is a decline in the Petrocaribe and in the subsidized exports of Venezuela. But still, the basic point continues being true that almost half of the production of Venezuela is not, PDVSA doesn't get cash from it. Not all is the same type of deal because, of course, part of it is a repayment of loans to China that the money did get to Venezuela, but it was spent not by PDVSA but by the government. So But this is sort of another problematic trend. And the other thing is that, Venezuela is importing today almost, depending on the figures, between 200 and 300,000 barrels of oil per day, about half of it as diluent for extra heavy oil. That includes products and light oil. And also it's importing more than it used to import for domestic consumption, and as I said, at a significant loss. In terms of PDVSA itself, some worrisome trends that had been happening even before the collapse in the price of oil include the fact that most of the money was being spent not in exploration and production, but in social programs and transfers to discretionary government funds. And the debt of PDVSA, increased dramatically from a very low level of $3 billion to about $46 billion today. And this is the financial debt. If you add the debt to suppliers, partners, you have an additional 10 to 15. It depends on how you measured it in terms of the exchange rate. So it's not a clear figure. And then you have the debt with the central bank, which is something that sounds crazy, but the Venezuelan government owes 800 billion bolivars. PDVSA owes 100 billion bolivars to the central bank, which basically, is printing money to finance the domestic expenditures of PDVSA. And then you have the arbitrations that, even though are not necessarily going to be paid are owed by the republic, by the government, not by PDVSA, they will have to be paid by PDVSA anyways. In terms of, independent figures that we can find on Venezuela, one, of course, that we always look at is the number of oil rigs in operation reported by Baker Hughes. And there you see that it has not, and if you look at it on average, it has declined in the last 3 years. There has been a slight increase very recently, but on average, the number of oil rigs in operation have been pretty stable in the last few years, with a slight decline. The other problem, of course, is the legacy of the expropriation period in Venezuela. Venezuela is ranked as the country with the least attractive, with the most obstacle to investment in the Fraser Institute index. And as you can see there, they were adding additional jurisdictions in the bottom line here. You see, and Venezuela keeps being the worst in the world. Even if you add 20 other countries, all are above Venezuela. So basically, it's a legacy that it's really costly in terms of attraction of investment, in terms of the risk that companies perceive that the country has. In terms of productivity, there are different. It's sort of hard to measure the productivity with the financial figures that we get. But one striking fact is that the number of barrels per employee has collapsed over the last few years by a dramatic increase in the number of employees and the decline in production that we know. The domestic consumption is also an issue that there is some discrepancy. This is the BP figure, and it says that it's 124,000 barrels per day. The Venezuelan government has a lower figure, and there are different estimates. But in any case, the clear pattern is a significant increase because, of course, partly because of economic growth during a period, but mostly because of the gasoline is free. If you basically, you see here one thing that when I explain this to people in Saudi Arabia, they cannot, Saudi sells domestically at $21 per barrel in domestic gasoline. Venezuela sells for 1 cent a barrel. So basically, zero for any. So to conclude, so there are very worrisome trends in the oil industry in Venezuela. Of course, the decline in production, but more than proportional decline in net exports because of the combination of the increase in the domestic consumption and the imports, the new imports both for diluents and for the domestic market. Limited exports, the cash flow from exports, as I said, partly is not getting back to PDVSA. The basket of Venezuelan oil is becoming much heavier. It's now sort of the reverse of what it was 10 years ago in terms of the mix between extra heavy and light oil. and the most productive fields of the country are declining, and PDVSA's own operated production is collapsing. The company has a lot of problems. Debt rising, investment is stagnant, costs have been rising, productivity collapsing. It has a very severe problem of human resources that, of course, started with the firing of half of the employees in 2003. But recently, the wages in PDVSA are very low compared to the international market, and even though today is not an easy time to find an oil job out anywhere, still, Venezuelans are willing to work for like a fraction of anyone else. So it's very hard for PDVSA to keep good people inside the company. But all this is leading to something that I think is very important to keep in mind, which is a tremendous dose of pragmatism that I ask in the paper if it's pragmatism or desperation. I mean, there are very strong signs that started about 2 years ago of the government trying to deal with this crisis, signs of pragmatism that you don't see anywhere else in the Venezuelan public sector, I mean, in economic policy or in other areas. But here you see them, and they start from symbolic things like Reuters reported that, that Eulogio del Pino, the new president of PDVSA, asked their executives to be on time to the meetings with foreign companies and dress appropriately. Which was not the case before, that kind of thing, to much more substantive things like the contract that they signed with Chevron a while ago, that basically gives a lot of control over the cash flow to the partners and provides more operational control in the projects. Also, they made the windfall tax, they created an exemption and make it flexible. In other cases, they are working on issues of the exchange rate that is used for the oil industry. And in terms of the strategy of PDVSA, you see a much more pragmatic strategy of focusing on blending and not building upgraders, but totally focusing on increasing production in the Orinoco Belt, which is the easy way of increasing production and finding diluents in the world markets to blend it. However, and other example is the decline in Petrocaribe exports and the increase in exports to the U.S. But all this pragmatism, I think, is unlikely to have a significant impact in the short term due to, first of all, of the low oil prices that, particularly not because of of course, it affects the capex that any international company is willing to invest in Venezuela, but most importantly, it affects PDVSA that doesn't have enough capex to do what it should be doing, and then the human resources problems, the risk environment, and the macro imbalances that Venezuela is facing, that usually, the oil sector is sort of immune to that kind of thing. But of course, it affects your operation there, and issues of instability, political instability, security issues. However, as I said, because of the tremendous endowment that Venezuela has, and I think it's important to keep in mind, I think some people get the wrong idea that Venezuela's oil is uncompetitive at the range of prices that we have had recently. I think with the right conditions, Venezuela and Orinoco Belt could even be developed at prices like $50 per barrel. So if investor-friendly policies continue, and if there is some sort of degree of political instability in the future, particularly with a change in administration, if it's politically stable, and those are big ifs, then there is a significant upside potential in sort of the longer term. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Francisco, for that great overview and excellent paper, which I commend to all of you. I hope you'll, as I said, take a look on our website and read it. We're going to have a short conversation about it now, get some reactions from our other panelists, and then open it up to those in the audience sitting here in person, as well as those watching online. Again, you can submit your questions via Twitter at the hashtag CGEP events. So along with Professor Monaldi, we're joined by, to his right, by Luisa Palacios, who's Senior Managing Director and Head of Latin America Macro and Energy Research at Medley Global Energy Advisors. She joined Medley from Barclays, where she was a Latin American macro strategist in the Emerging Markets Research Group, and before that was a senior energy economist for Japan Bank of International Cooperation, focusing on Latin America, energy and economics, and most importantly for our present purposes is a graduate of Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, as well as holding a PhD from Johns Hopkins SAIS, where she did her dissertation on the political economy of reforms in the oil industry in Latin America. So very relevant expertise to the topic we're here to talk about today. And then to her right, I'm very excited to give you Antoine's new title, which is Senior Fellow and Director of the Global Oil Markets Research Program at the Center on Global Energy Policy here at Columbia. Antoine has been in that job for about 1 week. His 20-year career in energy spans the world of government, international organizations, the private sector, higher education, and he most recently, before coming here, was the chief oil analyst at the International Energy Agency, where he was responsible for its two most authoritative publications, the Oil Market Report and the Medium-Term Oil Market Outlook. Before that was at the Energy Information Administration, held several private sector positions. Before that, has served for several years, I forget, 6 years, I think, as an adjunct professor, also here at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and is co-editor of Energy, Poverty, Global Challenges, and Local Solutions from Oxford University Press, which Bill Clinton called a must-read for anyone serious about creating meaningful solutions to end poverty. I presume that's because I wrote one of the chapters. So we're delighted to have Antoine here today, and especially to have Antoine with us at the Center on Global Energy Policy now, given how important the issues are that we're here to talk about in energy markets, policy, and geopolitics. So let me just let you each give a little bit of a response. Luisa, starting with you, generally to the paper and to the presentation you heard, what you agreed with and what you disagreed with, and particularly when you put it all together, what you think that means for the economic outlook and political situation in Venezuela that lies ahead.
So many questions. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with this distinguished panel. I think I agree with a lot of the conclusions that Francisco has on the paper. I'm a little bit less constructive on the pragmatism that I see from the Venezuelan government. Both you do agree with the economic policy front, but also on the oil policy front, because I think it should be seen in a relative perspective. When we look at what other countries, both in Latin America and the rest of the world, are doing in relation to trying to adjust their oil industry to the fact that the oil prices are, we are facing a new normal on oil prices, what I see is that Venezuela lags significantly behind, even if they have done some small steps towards more pragmatism, they lag significantly behind other countries. And just to show the second or the third most important producer in the region, which is Mexico, it's going through a transformation in terms of its energy sector, in terms of its opening its exploration and production to private sector investments. But the discussions that I see in Argentina and in Brazil, even in Brazil, in Colombia, about we have to reduce the fiscal take, we have to make ourselves more attractive, we have to. So I don't see those discussions in Venezuela. I do see, timidly, a discussion about trying to reduce the royalty rate, which is 30%, the highest the highest certainly in Latin America, to 20, but that has not panned out. So what I would say is that there are some indications of certain pragmatism, but not to the extent that you would expect, given the magnitude of the shock that we're seeing. And so when I look at what has happened, and when I look at the indicators, I see that, and I completely agree with how Francisco has framed this. To me, Venezuela is migrating to a higher cost producer. It's not a high cost producer, it's just migrating upgrading to a higher cost producer than it was. Because the fact is that conventional crude Venezuela used to be a conventional crude producer, and it's now, as Francisco clearly showed, becoming a much heavier producer, developing non-conventional oil resources. And what I see is that the basket of Venezuela is becoming heavier and heavier. I've done calculations about the weighted average of Venezuelan oil basket, and we're already below 16 degrees API on a weighted average basis. And so it is important that Venezuela has to import light oil in order to blend it with its very heavy oil. The reason being is that it then becomes less competitive because we have had discussions about exactly what will the blend look like. I've seen in Canada that the blend is because you have Canada and Venezuela are moving away from the idea that you upgrade the heavy oil. It's the blending is what's the new business model. In Canada, it's 70 to 30%. In Venezuela, you probably can do something less, between 30, maybe 20%. Either way, that increases the cost of production or the cost of developing that oil by $10 to $15. And so in PDVSA's annual reports, what you can see is a constant increase in the cost of producing oil, which is now the oil Orinoco. It's about $20 to $25. So you add $10 to that, that's already you're between 30 to 35, and we're not even talking about income taxes. And so to me, this is when you are a country that is moving, it's doing the opposite than the shale oil producers are doing. Instead of cutting costs, it is increasing cost. And the problem of Venezuela, although the oil sector is exogenous in a way to the rest of the economy, what I would argue is that is actually not the case in Venezuela, because it does matter whether the oil sector does use its domestic capacity, domestic supply capacity in general. And I say this because one of the important things that I see in Latin America is that the significant devaluations that we have seen on depreciations of the currency at the end do affect also capex. I mean, you can renegotiate contracts, you can lower or increase the component of domestic suppliers to your capex, and so the decrease in capex doesn't have to be that dramatic. But if the country doesn't produce anything, or there's a significant collapse in the production of everything in Venezuela, what that means is that your capex is highly dollarized, which means that Venezuela actually doesn't have a lot of capacity to reduce the cost of production. So it does matter what your macro situation is. And so in a way, the oil sector is understood as an exogenous industry, but I think the macro situation significantly affects the oil industry, and the oil industry affects the macro situation. It's a two-way street. Let me stop there with the comments.
And can you talk a little bit about the political outlook as you see it? How concerned should we be about the stability of the regime in Venezuela, and what play out a few scenarios for how that might look based on the oil price fall?
Me?
Luisa.
Okay.
And then you as well, Francisco.
Because this is an extremely highly dependent country in oil, I think what we're seeing is that the country that is not adjusting either in the oil sector in a significant way or in the economic front is what you're seeing stresses all across the sector. So you see stresses on the economic front, you see stresses on the domestic economy, you see stresses on the political system. And so as Francisco was saying, we're heading towards legislative elections. What I see is this is a government that has a particularly high exit cost, and is heading towards an election that could be decisive in terms of what it means for politics and for regime change going forward. And so there are a lot of questions about how exactly are these elections going to unfold, because at each point, at each decision, at each juncture in which this government has had to decide between abiding by democratic rules or not, it has decided not. And so in all the other instances, maybe it was not as dramatic as an election, right? And so we're heading towards a very important election in a country that is in the midst of significant economic stresses, with one of the highest inflations in the world, with scarcity of goods and services, with the high unemployment. I mean, where in any other country you would have seen significant social tensions emerging, but in Venezuela, you have not seen them yet, in part because the government has a significant lid on the population, either through complete control of the media that prevents riots or some kind of manifestations from propagating or becoming massively known, and that's it creates repeating mechanisms. So you have completely dismantled that. You have also followed or used your security forces, your military, to control more and more any kind of signs of social distress. So the elections, what I see is that the Maduro administration, in a way, has dismantled any possibility of political aggregation of political manifestation of differences, of wanting change, both on the economic and the political front. So the elections, to me, are a very important moment for Venezuelan politics, because it is, if the elections take place and the opposition is allowed to win, I think it will be significantly important for the political stability of Venezuela, because that is it will show that at the end, there is some kind of limit, and that democratic institutions or at some kind of a democratic role continues to exist, which will allow the possibility of an institutional change. And that's very important for the stability of the country, not only politically and economically, but I would also say for the oil industry in general. Because we do get asked a lot the question of whether Venezuela could become a geopolitical risk at some point. I mean, whether the political situation could end up making Venezuela a geopolitical risk. And what I would say is that
It's not one now.
it's not one now, and it's not one in many other political scenarios. If those political scenarios play out, even if it's in a longer time frame, at some point towards a regime change in an institutional way. And so elections, the appearance, the fact that elections can take place and that the opposition, which as Francisco clearly showed has such a big gap, is allowed to win, which many people in the country are very concerned about, I think will significantly alleviate the tensions and allow the process to take place, even if it's a longer process. But if that doesn't happen, what I would say is that you enter into a much more unstable type of scenario, one in which many other things, anything can happen, because then you don't even allow the possibility that a population that is 80% against you shows their discontent. There is just no way for the system to allow change to take place, and that to me leads to a much more explosive situation at some point.
Francisco Monaldi, do you agree with that, and your perception of geopolitical risk and the potential for political instability in Venezuela?
Yeah, well, let's go. I think I generally agree with everything that Luisa said, including the things that she disagreed with me before. But let me go to the politics. I mean, on the politics, the scenarios are, first you have to keep in mind that with these margins, the logical conclusion anywhere else would be that the opposition will get a 2/3 majority. And so there will be a landslide that could lead to regime change if the rules of the game were played with. There are a variety of reasons why that is probably unlikely, including, of course, all sorts of limits to the democratic expression of the vote, but also, malapportionment is very significant, and the rural areas are dominated by the Chavismo still. The Chavismo did a lot of gerrymandering that sort of make it that allows them to be a little bit more represented than otherwise they would be. And of course, there is the worry that there might be some fraud in the elections on the day of the elections. One of the most explosive, I think, issues is that the electoral council in Venezuela is totally distrusted by the country. So we're heading to this very crucial election with no arbiter that is respected by anyone. So that's I think going to be potentially a big problem. But I agree with Luisa that the most explosive scenario is if the Chavismo does not allow this electoral majority to lead to at least a simple majority in the National Assembly, because both the international community and everyone, for the first time, not only the opposition is a majority, but voters believe that the opposition is a majority, a significant majority. So they will be really upset by the fact that this election doesn't lead to a majority in the National Assembly and for the opposition. Of course, as Luisa mentioned, the exit costs for this regime are very significant for a variety of reasons. Extremely polarized country, all the issues that have to do with human rights, drug trafficking, all sorts of things that sort of are around the issue. So it's going to be very difficult. And the other thing is that you don't see clear sort of, the opposition it's a very weakly tied coalition, and there are no clear leaders that are the ones that you should be negotiating with on either side. So it's a very complex situation. However, I tend to agree, maybe for lack of imagination as a Venezuelan, that it's unlikely that we will have, a major geopolitical event or a disruption, a massive disruption in production or things of that nature. But my colleagues that have followed these type of situations in other regions of the world seem to be, they look at the facts and they say, well, I don't know why you are so optimistic about it. Yeah, exactly so.
And so we talked about the impacts within Venezuela. I just wanted to ask you also about more outside Venezuela, regional impacts. Venezuela maintains subsidized oil sales and product sales to many Caribbean and Latin American countries under the Petrocaribe agreement. To what extent are economies out in the region exposed to risk, and what could the potential political impacts be, geopolitical risk impacts be more broadly?
You want to start with me, or?
Why don't you start?
Okay, I mean, I am not an expert in the region in the Caribbean region, but I mean, the first fact is that the exports, subsidized exports, are being cut significantly. So these countries are gonna suffer. Of course, this happens when the price of oil is much lower than it was before, and it would have been a disaster for them at a very high price because they were paying $100 per barrel. Now they're paying less, but it's still, it's a significant, for some countries it's actually dramatic. I mean, like Haiti and some other countries in the Caribbean, but I'm not an expert on this side, but I had a meeting with people that follow these countries, and they were pretty worried about it. That, by the way, includes Cuba itself, that even though it's probably the country that is going to be cut the least compared to others, apparently they are also being cut. So that's, I think, a certainty that we have, that this is going to continue happening. I mean, the regime, it's very interesting because, everyone sort of seems the obvious connection between the voting in the OAS and the Petrocaribe program. And they last week just had the vote in which for the first time, some Caribbean countries sort of didn't vote with Venezuela. But then you had a meeting of Petrocaribe in which Maduro offered even more for the future, promise of things. So it's sort of a very, it's a game of I mean, I think everybody in the region knows that this is going to be dramatically cut, and that they cannot count on Venezuela, but everybody is trying to get as much as they can while it lasts. So that's one potential follow-up. Of course, the other issues you are seeing now in the border with Colombia, the debacle in Venezuela will have some impact in Colombia, and the other one, I mean, in terms of the market, the oil market in the region, as Luisa mentioned, the competition from Mexico, it's really going to be a very significant new factor to reckon for Venezuela, because now you have the country that was the closest. I mean, Venezuela was much more open than Mexico during the Chavismo in the oil sector, but now it has a formidable competitor in the region that has in some ways a similar. I mean, it has a lot of heavy oil too, and so it's going to be a problem for Venezuela.
Antoine Halff, let me ask you to kind of put it in the broader context of the global oil market today, how should we think about, how do you think about Venezuela? How important is it? Based on what you heard Francisco present in his study, how do you think that impacts the outlook, which we've seen this sort of historic price collapse in the last year? How does that impact the outlook? And are you, or do you think markets are as complacent as we heard Francisco and Luisa are about the potential for outages, geopolitical risk in Venezuela?
Well, I think it's an extremely important country, and I do agree that the market is a bit complacent about Venezuela today, partly because we are at a moment in the oil market when we live under the impression that we've moved to an age of abundance from an age of scarcity. There's plenty of oil being produced in the U.S. Dependency on Venezuelan supplies in the U.S. has decreased. It's not just that Venezuela is less able to produce than it was in the past. It's also that the need for Venezuelan oil has decreased in the U.S. at this time. But there's also plenty of supply elsewhere in the world. And right now, Venezuelan supplies matter less for the market as a whole than they have perhaps at other times in history. But they do matter tremendously, nevertheless. And even though it's less than it used to be, it's still a very large chunk of the market. And it's not just the volumes being produced, they're down, but they're still very high. But it's also the location, the way Venezuela fits within the region, within the Americas, within the Gulf of Mexico. It's still very important for Gulf of Mexico refiners because it's a one source of heavy oil. Heavy oil is less valuable than light oil, but for refiners, it's much more interesting in the US market, precisely because of the shale revolution. The shale is extremely light, and that makes the need or the appetite for cheaper, heavier oil all the greater in the Gulf of Mexico. So paradoxically, Venezuela matters less, but in some ways it matters more. Then it's very important historically because Venezuela has always had a very unique role in the leadership, in the global governance of the oil industry, in the oil market. It's been a leader of OPEC. It's been a leading cheater also within OPEC. Then it's been a leading enforcer of OPEC discipline. It's gone through cycles up and down, resource nationalism, opening apertura, nationalism again. So now the question is, are we on the cusp of another cycle of opening and business friendliness and higher production? Or has the pendulum swing suddenly come to a halt, and is it frozen and unable to move back and continue the kind of dynamic swing that it has displayed historically? So I think the paper is really great because it comes at a very timely. It's very timely. It comes at a moment when politically Venezuela looks like it could be at a turning point, and I don't think there's any huge surprise in the paper. There's nothing that made me think, I was completely wrong about this. But there's a huge degree of granularity, and it's also extremely clear, concise, and dispassionate. It's very fact-based, very granular, very detailed, very articulate, and very synthetic. So it's really helpful to try to understand what the issues are and to try to frame the questions that are before us. But I think the questions remain largely open. We don't really know how things will play out, how the impact of the elections will affect production, will affect the country as a whole, and will affect its role in the market. What's remarkable, I think, when we look at Venezuela over the last few years, especially since the price collapse, when the price collapsed starting about a year ago, almost all the analysts in the oil market said, well, the price is collapsing, so production will collapse. The price drops, so the oil revenues that can be reinvested into production are drying out. Companies are cutting their spending, cutting their budgets, so there will be less production. And in fact, the exact opposite has happened. There has been more production since the price has collapsed, for reasons that we can understand. I mean, part of it is just the resilience of the U.S. industry and the reasons why U.S. shale is so productive, so resilient. But part of it is that countries that depend on their oil revenues, when the price collapses, in fact, have an incentive to produce more because they need to make up in volume what they lose in revenue per barrel. And even some of the countries that seem the least capable of increasing production have been able to increase production in this downturn. Russia, faced with sanctions, faced with a collapsing currency, faced with a dramatic drop in revenues, has been able to achieve record levels of production in recent months. Nigeria, with all these problems, has maintained reasonably high levels of production, has been creeping up production over the last few months. Iraq, with the Islamic State insurgency or campaign, has lost a third of its territory. It's facing humongous above-ground problems. The impact of the price collapse has been dramatic on the budget, on the financial resources of the country. It's producing at record highs. Only Venezuela has not been able to achieve this kind of performance. And this is interesting, and this raises questions. Why is that the case? Partly it's because, unlike, for instance, Saudi Arabia, which also has been producing at record highs, or other Gulf countries, there's no buffers. Some countries have had financial buffers they have been able to rely on. Venezuela doesn't have those buffers. The production, the nature of the resource is difficult. It's becoming tough oil. It's difficult oil. It's not an easy resource to develop. And just the legacy of the mismanagement of the Chavez years, it's just the damage has been so large that it's very difficult to overcome on the dime. Now, the question, I think, is what happens next? What happens if the opposition wins the election, or if Maduro continues on his pragmatic approach? Is there a potential for things to improve in the next few months? And I don't have the answer to that question, but I think one line of argument would say, yes, there's tremendous potential for more production because they've been underperforming. They've been playing their cards so badly that there are many low-hanging fruits. It would be easy to bring investment back and to get the house in order and to get production back again on the rise. But another line would be, no, there's going to be a period of prolonged period of unrest, uncertainty, instability, perhaps civil war, perhaps fighting. That sometimes doesn't stop production from going. Iraq, Libya have been producing in the midst of civil wars. How would that play out in Venezuela? I think we can argue this back and forth. But also another issue is, has there been, and maybe that's one issue where your paper doesn't go too much in depth, has there been long-lasting damage caused to the reservoirs by the mismanagement of PDVSA under Chavez? And the resources are huge, but the producing fields have been mismanaged, and have they been exhausted? Has the pressure been depleted? Is there some long-lasting loss of capacity that Venezuela has suffered, and that might not be easy to recover, or might never be recovered in future? So that's some of the questions I think that we face.
Did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and it's hard to answer because we don't have, transparent information for sure. Some signs, of some of the things that you mentioned. The Venezuelan government is being able to increase production in the Orinoco Belt, as you saw. So the easy thing, which is sort of, bringing some additional investment into an area with zero geological risk. Because even though there are other problems with the extra heavy, it's something that it's pretty straightforward in terms of, you drill, you extract. The issue is getting the infrastructure right and bringing the diluent. But in the more complex, in the existing conventional fields, that's where, all the tales that you hear from service contractors, et cetera, is that the infrastructure is in total disrepair. It's in very bad shape, and that things are going to keep going down in terms of, even, major accidents, environmental problems of all sorts are going to continue to go up. So that's a potentially big problem. And there is the notion among some geologists that the more productive fields were exploited in a way that destroyed the future production capacity. So there seems to be a lot of what you're mentioning. On the other hand, if you want to look at sort of the half full, half empty, even if you consider the conventional reserves of Venezuela, the conventional reserves of Venezuela, nobody knows exactly which they are because never been audited, and they are suspiciously stable. However, if you sort of take a figure and then you even divide it by 2 and you take some assumptions, Venezuela has 20 times or 10 times the reserves of Colombia in conventional oil. So if you had an institutional environment that it's more amenable to small companies that can be entrepreneurs, et cetera, you could significantly turn around, I think, eventually the production. And you see that even under these terrible circumstances, production in the non-PDVSA projects, in the JVs, is slightly going up, has been slightly going up for a while, and there is some investment happening. So even though I totally agree with Luisa that if you compare to, if your point of comparison is the rest of the region, for example, Chevron is both in Venezuela and in Argentina, right? In Argentina, they are being, offered anything to invest, and it's sort of a tremendously attractive environment given the situation of the world market. In Venezuela, is much less interesting. However, they are investing some money in Venezuela, and they are slowly increasing production there. So there is some movement. And the other point of comparison, as I mentioned, is with the rest of what is happening in Venezuela. You see that the head of PDVSA is a guy who knows about oil. You see that these symbolic changes that I mentioned. You see, and even though they are still very far from doing what they need to do, it's surprising how much sort of change in strategy there has been compared to other sectors.
Yeah, Luisa, go ahead.
I was going to comment on one thing that I think you're completely right, which is Venezuela matters particularly for the derivatives market, because where I do think that there's the cuts in capex in Venezuela have been in PDVSA have been important, and so you invest only in exploration and production. So the refinery front is in disarray. The amount of stoppages that you are operating at 50-60% utilization capacity. So the probability that you have accidents, like the one that we had in Antoine, for example, Perdón, where that was an event for at least the products market for pretty much a month. So I think that's a more likely scenario under whatever political, more likely event under whatever political scenario you want to envision. I do think that political scenarios matter for the probability that you have a significant disruption in oil production. That's a much more difficult thing to do, like the 2000 and 2003 strike. I think the probability of that happening is much less under different political scenarios. There's one political scenario, which is, well, if the country simply is in total chaos, then at least the oil markets are going to be bullish about that, because eventually there could be a much important disruption. That said, what I see, and I think your comment about that the only place that you don't see increases in oil production is Venezuela, which according to their own numbers, since December, they've lost 70,000 barrels per day of oil production. And I think that talking about what Francisco is saying is that, to me, that a loss of technical capacity and mismanagement is such that you see it in the declines in conventional crude, which I think are about, every year about 80 to 100,000 barrels per day. So they have to bring on stream 100,000 barrels per day of Orinoco. And as you just mentioned, they've brought in the half of the year only 40. And so you are seeing the declines because conventional crude continues to decline. For example, I completely agree that El Furrial, which is to me, it's like Venezuela's mini Cantarell situation, because that was the largest field producing 500,000 barrels, about 400,000 barrels per day in 2012, has lost 30% of its capacity in 2 years. Mm-hmm. And so, and that's the most dramatic one, right? And so I do think that the government in this at least rhetorical mentioning of things that they would like to do is that, we're going to launch a marginal fields round. Well, that's where technical capacity matters. I mean, because the Mexicans can pull it off, and Venezuela would have been able to pull that off at any other point in time. But now, understanding how to do an auction of marginal fields, what fields, it's just takes longer. So that's where I do think that technical capacity matters, and those political scenarios matter. The regime change, I think, then that would be actually not positive for the oil markets, because there will be, although this is not even, I think talking about regime change is not really an imminent thing. I think it's going to take a while for this to happen. But it does matter, your political scenario, for understanding where oil production is going. And for the time being, my base case scenario is that what you're going to see is continuous declines of oil production. Like last year was 100,000 barrels per day. This year could be somewhere between 50 to 100,000 barrels per day. And I think the other event that we have not talked about is the effect that eventually default will have on Venezuela, which it's not obvious exactly the timing of that, the probabilities of that, but I would say that that will constrain as well and could accelerate declines. But in all of those scenarios, it's not a geopolitical risk per se, but just an acceleration of declines.
And when we think about the fiscal strain on the government, you look at the declining production, and as you showed, also the sharply rising consumption that they're essentially giving away for free. We've seen several countries, mostly oil importers, but also oil exporters like the United Arab Emirates, use this opportunity of low oil prices to reduce fuel subsidies. Is there any prospect of seeing pricing reform in Venezuela?
Well, before the election, I think we can pretty much be sure that it's not going to happen. But they have been announcing this for a while already, and from time to time, they start talking about it, and then the president says, no, it's not going to happen anytime soon. I mean, the issue is now, of course, more significant because also the massive smuggling to Colombia and part of the border issue has to do with that. I think it's going to happen. I think the problem, of course, is that they need some institutional capacity to implement it, because if they increase it in any meaningful way, it will hurt. It will be a tough thing for a segment of the population, even though it's very regressive subsidy. Still, for the poor, it's it's relevant, and so you have to have, like in Iran they did, you have to have a compensation mechanism, and they have been very incapable of implementing any type of policy of that sort. But I think it will eventually happen. The other, major and crazy issue that has a lot to do with all that we're talking about is the issue of the exchange rate, right? Venezuela has a 100-time difference between the black market and the lower official exchange rate, and that is even sort of easier to do than increasing the gasoline price, and they have been unable to do anything significant in exchange rate reform. And theoretically, they are waiting for the elections. But then, what happens if the elections, either the opposition has a big win or even, whatever scenario, do you think that in January they could make a huge adjustment on the exchange rate? I mean, it doesn't look like also a good time either. So I mean, it's really, and you need a government with some degree of credibility. The other issue that we haven't mentioned, and I'm not macroeconomist, but there is a risk of hyperinflation in Venezuela, and I'm talking about real hyperinflation, not the high inflation that we're seeing now, but the one that overthrows governments and that creates the tensions that we saw in other regions. So that might be the event that actually leads to some significant political change, a real hyperinflation.
I will just say on that topic of fuel subsidies, I mean, there's a broad consensus that they are both economically and environmentally wasteful because they encourage too much consumption. The question, of course, politically is how do you roll them back without riots in the streets? And so we were interested in that question and decided to look at success stories and what lessons could be learned from a political economy perspective on how to remove fuel subsidies successfully. And Johannes Erpelinen in the political science department here at Columbia has written with some co-authors a paper for us on that that'll come out in a couple of weeks. And if you're on our mailing list, you'll see that. Let me open it up now to questions from the audience. If you could stand up and stand at the microphone in the aisle, that would be helpful. Let me remind those watching online that you can ask questions with the hashtag CGEP events. And for those listening to the podcast, all our events are available on podcast through iTunes, as well as on our website. Just a reminder that we're here with Francisco Monaldi from Rice University, Luisa Palacios from Medley Global Advisors, and Antoine Halff from the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy. If you could please briefly identify yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mariana Martin. I'm Venezuelan. I'm a recent CEPA graduate. I have a question about the elections, actually. We've seen in all the elections that happen every year in the past 16 years that this enormous spending from PDVSA, finance from PDVSA to the election. And given this election is significantly important and they're struggling with the popular support, do you think we're going to see again this enormous spending on the elections? And then my second question is related to that. Yes, it is very significant, and if the opposition wins, I also think it's going to be a big legway to change. Do you think that's going to be the case if the opposition doesn't win the third majority? Thank you.
Who'd like to take that?
Well, briefly on the issue of as you mentioned, the playbook of the Chavismo in any important election has been to engineer a massive expenditure boom and do every sort of the extreme version of a political business cycle. However, this time it's much more difficult than any time before, and I think we are already less than 3 months from the election, and anything they can do in the classic sort of sense of increasing expenditure, increasing imports, etc., it's unlikely to have a dramatic effect. There could be other non-standard, non-traditional things. In Venezuela, everyone talk about the DACASO, which is the previous elections. The president announced that electrical appliances will be sold at a fraction of their price, and he got a bump of 10% in the polls before the election. I think these kinds of events are harder to manufacture right now because the disenchantment is very deep, and you see the numbers. The distrust in the government is very significant. There is very difficult to build again a sort of a honeymoon kind of effect. However, we can expect something to happen if we we see the recent history. One thing that actually worries me is how dramatic the scenario is looking in terms of the advantage by the opposition, because in some radical elements in the government they might feel that there is no way that this scenario is acceptable to them, and they might be willing to do some crazy stuff. In terms of the 2/3 or one, I think this is a scenario. It's more a political than an institutional scenario. It's in the end, I think it's much more how both internally and internationally this transition is able to be engineered. A government that has such a low level of support in a normal democracy can be sustained because there is a general legitimacy. But here, in a very polarized environment, it's much harder for it to continue the business as usual that we're seeing. So I think it will be a very, very difficult moment, and of course we cannot discard a variety of scenarios. But I think the most likely one is a victory of the opposition with at least some significant number of additional deputies. It's much harder to believe that 2/3.
Next question.
Good evening. Albert Golston, Indo-Brazilian Associates. Question specifically how it impacts Venezuela. The short-term issue is that there's an OPEC meeting coming up on November 27th, and just want the panel's assessment. What do you think will come out of that meeting? To what extent can Venezuela persuade OPEC members to establish any sort of a production quota to actually enforce it? The other basically is also longer term. In the United States, there's legislation that would permit the export of refined petroleum products. Now, granted, Venezuelan oil is completely different. It's heavier type of oil versus what we export, which is Louisiana Light, and of course it has different margins. However, that would still represent significant additional petroleum products on the market, particularly in the region. I just want the panel's assessment of those scenarios.
Who wants to take that?
I can start, and I think, briefly on the products. It's not. The products can be exported now.
are thinking about is about oil lighter oil being exported. By the way, I think it would be great for Venezuela if the restrictions on export of light oil from the U.S. Get either lifted or at least at some point if Venezuela can establish a deals of swaps or something, because there is a natural deal to be made there, because Venezuela needs light oil, and the closest and least easiest to get is from the U.S. So that would be in the long run something that we might see happening. In terms of the OPEC, I think, of course, Venezuela is desperate. I mean, it's the only country in OPEC that is not being able to increase production. Everybody else, is basically either increasing it or like Iran expecting to increase significantly. So Venezuela is in a desperate situation. They, as you know, have tried to broker meetings with the Russians to come up to some deal. I'm not an expert on the Middle East producers, but my impression is that this is not likely to. And in fact, I think the efforts by Venezuela being so openly unsuccessful, actually, it's sort of in a negative. It shows more and more how. At some point, I guess that if the price collapses even more, there might be some. But I don't think Venezuela, even though, as Antoine mentioned, has had historically a role that it has been more significant than it should be because of the size of production in OPEC. I think it's also unlikely to have some.
Antoine, does U.S. oil export policy matter for Venezuela, or does it just displace if they sell us more crude, or if they don't sell to us, they sell to someone else?
Well, I think I agree. It would be a benefit for Venezuela if crude exports were opened up more broadly in the U.S., because refiners would be very happy to ship out light crude and to import heavier crude from Venezuela. So that would be a market. It's still, the natural market for Venezuelan oil is still the U.S. Gulf of Mexico, is still the backyard of the natural market. And many refineries in the Gulf have been configured precisely to run that kind of crude. So that would be a good thing for both sides, I think. In terms of OPEC, it's always tricky to try to forecast the outcome of OPEC meetings. People get it wrong sometimes, especially when the outcome seems to be a foreordained conclusion. But when Saudi Arabia decided last November not to cut production and not to try to support prices, but to maintain production, eventually they actually increased production. Venezuela was against it. Other OPEC countries lobbied against it. But then most countries just accepted the decision and tried to increase production. Venezuela would really has nothing to gain from that, has everything to lose from that policy. And it tried to work against it, but it has very few allies left in OPEC. Iran was its counterpart, its natural ally, the other hawk or super hawk within OPEC. Iran is now, post agreement with the U.S. on nuclear, with the P5+1 on the nuclear issues. It's preparing its comeback in the market. It's thinking about ramping up production in a dramatic way, not cutting back production. Saudi Arabia gives no sign that it wants to reconsider its decision. All other countries are trying to boost production. So it's not likely to be able to convince others to cut back. I don't think so.
The only important threat in Venezuela in terms of a country is if Canada manages to export significantly more heavy oil into the Gulf Coast. And since the Keystone Pipeline is, for the time being, out of the agenda, I think that was the most important threat that I saw from the Venezuelans.
Do you know something about forthcoming State Department decisions?
No. But it was not even at that point, which was at the end of 2014. The Venezuelans were very worried about that. They can actually identify that is a huge threat to them. So that is the U.S. energy policy that matters. It's going to be that one.
And some of you will have noticed today, House Energy and Commerce Committee subcommittee approved a bill to lift the restrictions on U.S. oil exports, although there's still a long way to go between that and actually removing that. Although if you want to understand the issue better, you can read the Navigating the Oil Export Debate report on the website of the Center on Global Energy Policy. Next question.
Hi, Regina Morales with Veracity Worldwide. I have two questions. First, I wanted to get your opinions on the blending of light and heavy crude oil in Venezuela, sort of like a competitive advantage versus the high cost associated with the blending. That's one. And then two, I think from what I understand, you both are pretty optimistic in terms of the upcoming legislative elections as to what will happen. Maybe just expand more about, just talk about what you think will happen, what you think is more likely. I know that it doesn't really seem that far away, but so many things could happen in between. So I guess talking a little bit more about those little scenarios between now and December. Thank you.
I think Francisco is more optimistic than I am about that election. What I think is that it's an extremely important election for the political scenarios going forward. And I don't think that even if the opposition doesn't get 2/3, just a simple majority to me has a huge it's a huge symbolic event, because it shows the Venezuelan population that, okay, you had to have 30% gap or had to have a 30% lead, but it was possible. It's that it's one institution that you can control. So I think it has huge implications that the opposition can win. If the Chavismo allows the opposition to win that elections. The thing is that this is not, and as Francisco was saying, in any other country, we would not be discussing about the outcome of the elections. It's already clear in the polls what the outcome of the elections should be. What I would say is that the only reason why we're having some doubts and there's some uncertainty is because of the past, of how the regime of this government has evolved in terms of its democratic credentials. And when you have a government that has huge exit costs and that has evolved in one single direction in terms of the democratic credentials, although this is a major thing, I mean, not allowing an election is a major thing. Even if you flirt with other things, elections it's like a no-no, right? It's like the last barrier. So it's a huge decision, but there's an uncertainty because we don't understand exactly, or faced with that decision, what there is some uncertainty about what the government might do. But what I would say is that to me it's extremely important that the elections take place and that the opposition wins. More importantly, for the political scenarios ahead, because it means that the political transition in an institutional way can take place. Because there's some institutions are responding in a certain way, so that you can, for example, move to a recall referendum. If that is the case, there are certain scenarios that can take place that require institutional response. And so you need that institutional response, and the elections are going to give that to you. If that institutional response is not there, then I think the pressures on political volatility will build up significantly, because then there's no way to enact. There's no way that the voters in Venezuela can make their voices heard. So I think it's the election results itself matters a lot for the political scenario that you're seeing, which will matter a lot as well for the oil scenario and for the economic scenarios in Venezuela. So that's why the elections themselves are extremely important. Whether the base case has to be that the elections will take place and that the opposition should win. But this will not be even a discussion if it were not for the fact that this is a more difficult political system.
So the queue is growing and time is running short. So I want to make sure we can get the questions in if possible. So what I'll suggest is that we take the three remaining questions and then give you a chance to respond collectively to all of them. Oh, on blending, yeah. Do you want to say something on that?
Well, the blending, I think it's just a solution, convenience. It's a lower upfront cost. The upgraders cost a lot of money. The initial investment is huge. Blending is less. The margins are less over time, but it's much more pragmatic. It's an immediate payoff, so it's a natural choice. Over time, if the U.S. exports. Venezuela is also a natural market for U.S. crude and for U.S. condensate, because they could use condensate from the U.S. to blend into the heavy oil. So it's not just the U.S. that's a natural market for Venezuelan crude. The other way around is true as well.
So let's quickly, if I could ask people to be brief and ask questions, and we'll give you a chance to respond to them.
Sure. My name is Ricardo Jaramillo. I'm also from Venezuela. I'm a freshman in the college. And my question is, what does a sustainable economic policy in the future for Venezuela look like? Does that include a decrease in social spending? Does that include a diversification away from oil at some point? And I wanted your thoughts on what that would look like in terms of a prosperous future for Venezuela.
Next, we'll take all the questions, please.
Hi, my name is Ángel Muñoz, and I am professor of Universidad del Zulia in Venezuela. I'm a climatologist. There is an El Niño right now. Electricity in Venezuela is hydro. So have you ever considered, it's amazing, all the background that you have given to me, that's not my area of expertise, is awesome for me. But have you considered what could happen? There is a drought right now. El Niño is there. It's one of the most intense El Niño in history on record. So no water, drought already there. Before election, this could be a mess. What if, this is a hypothesis, what if the dams have no water and there is no water in the next, 20 days? It's not only electricity. I'm also asking you, what do you think is going to happen in terms of people are already doing long lines to buy food, water. So it's going to be, I think it might be a mess. So have you considered that?
An additional mess.
Yeah. Yeah, last question.
Nicola Clavedio, also a Venezuelan and an entrepreneur in Venezuela. So my question, obviously, I think there's two important players that haven't been in a discussion, which is the private sector, unrelated to the oil industry, and how the private sector will be able to survive the dire economic situation. The shock is pretty massive on the exchange rate, on hyperinflation, and on the politics. And if the situation is also going to force the government maybe to mediate with the private sector as a solution to staying in power post-election. And then the second, I think, very important influence on what's going to happen post-election and prior to elections has been the Chinese and the alternative ways of financing. They've already exhausted a lot of the short-term kind of discounting Jamaica and the Petrocaribe countries' loans. And the only willing actor has been the Chinese in terms of financing and extending a hand to try to keep the government going. But it might also be part of the solution to get rid of the government when their investment becomes too risky politically. So I think in some insight on what you think the Chinese outlook will be post-election, and that's it. Thank you.
So let me ask you to each take 1 minute to comment on one or more of those questions.
Well, there are so many. Let me just pick. On the idea that I am optimistic on the election, it's not that I'm optimistic. I think the facts are so strong today that all the previous strategies to sort of, made fraud or increase popularity before the elections are not going to be enough this time, and therefore there could be a scenario in which there are either no elections, postponing the elections, or open massive fraud. But all of those, I think, will be tremendously costly for the government and will prompt a political crisis of major proportions. In terms of the blending strategy, I totally agree with what Antoine said. I think if you were in the shoes of the president of PDVSA today, you will do basically the same thing because of the restrictions to try to do anything else. It's sort of the only thing that it's relatively easy, and the cost of in general, as Luisa pointed out, even in Canada they are moving to blending. But in the case of Venezuela, imagine the cost of capital is the highest in the world. So why would you invest in a upgrader in Venezuela? So and just briefly on the big issues on the future of Venezuela. Venezuela has tremendous potential on oil. It has to develop it. But of course, at the peak oil price, if you divided all the oil rents of Venezuela among the population was $2,000 per person. So there is no future for Venezuela if it doesn't have a diversified economy. How to get there, of course, it's a big question that not for 30 seconds.
Luisa.
Wow. The Chinese are the most important investors in Venezuela. They are the most important producers in Venezuela. They are the most important providers of all services in Venezuela. So this is a relationship that is there, and whoever is in office will have. It's a relationship that will continue, and it's a relationship that other countries in Latin America have developed because it's the most important. It's one of the most important consumer markets in the world. So it's a relationship that you want to have. It's just a relationship that might have to be a little bit different. I, for a long time, do not believe really that the Chinese are the lenders of last resort. I think that they're suppliers of last resort. What they're providing Venezuela is exactly with the things that Venezuela with the things that the government is destroying, and that points to the private sector. I think when I see the adjustment that is taking place in Latin America in general, it's an adjustment that takes place through the FX. In that adjustment through the FX, we've seen Colombia 50% devaluation, Brazil 60% devaluation in a 12-month horizon. It's very costly in economic terms, and it comes with a significant decline in imports, but it leads to import substitution, and it leads to more competitive private sector, and eventually leads to exports. That is the way you adjust through a terms of trade, a shock of this magnitude. Venezuela has not done any of that. It has remained, the fixed exchange rate has remained fixed. You have allowed the parallel market rate to depreciate, and if you take that into account, a depreciation of more than 100%, which is the largest in the world, even more than Russia in the last 12 months. But that depreciation really doesn't work because it doesn't allow this FX mechanism to take place and the import substitution to take place. So what it has happened is that you are destroying supply and you're destroying domestic supply because of the way you're adjusting. So the macro situation is one of the most important things that you have to fix. And I see it in Argentina as well. They have amazing resources, but you have to fix the macro in order to be able to develop your oil resources in an effective and efficient way. And so what I would say is that you have to start with the macro situation. You have to start with rebuilding the domestic supply that you have destroyed, because Venezuela has been behaving like if it was Saudi Arabia, importing everything without really the dollar liquidity to be able to do that. And so to me, you're in self-destructing mode because the level of destruction of the private sector means that the adjustment that is taking place on the import side is so ineffective that is leading to the hyperinflation and scarcity. So I would say that you have many layers of change that needs to happen. The first one needs to be the macroeconomic adjustment, and then a lot of different reforms in order to restore private sector competitiveness and capacity.
And we're over time, so I want to wrap up. But just briefly, I want to make sure one question that was asked doesn't get lost about the climate impacts already being felt, the potential for extreme weather, the potential for drought. Are those issues getting any attention? Are they perceived as problems? And how do people think about the outlook of being a petrostate in light of those?
There's one thing about the electricity issue is that actually Venezuela, in line with what Francisco has been saying on its pragmatism, Repsol and Eni just brought on stream one of the largest gas reservoirs, La Perla in Venezuela. It's one of the largest in Latin America. It is producing right now 150 BCF per day. It is, by the end of the year, it's going to be producing 450 BCF per day. That is more than they were importing from Colombia. So they will have some ability to resort to gas-fired electricity. That's on the electricity front. They do have now a little bit more flexibility just because of those natural gas reserves that they brought on stream. On the waterfront is where I think the most problematic thing is.
Final comment, Antoine?
Just a couple of very quick words. The Chinese role, it's very opaque, very difficult to assess. Oftentimes, announcements of loans in Caracas are not matched by corresponding announcements in Beijing.
Yeah.
There's rumors of dissatisfaction in Beijing with the leadership in Caracas. But the relationship is not a dual relationship. It's not just takers and buyers and sellers. The Chinese are now part of a much more complex web of relationships in the country. And for instance, a lot of the Caribbean Petro-Carib contracts are now fulfilled by Chinese companies. Chinese companies are supplying the products to Caribbean countries on behalf of Venezuela. So it's a much more complex but very opaque relationship. And then in the private sector, the oil the industry can be a curse for a country. It has been for Venezuela to a large degree, but it can be a blessing, can be a source of job creation. And I think when the oil industry recovers in Venezuela, which it will do at some point, the recovery will have to entail a development of associated industries domestically. There has to be a well thought out local content dimension to the recovery of the industry, and local content itself can be disastrous or can be wonderful. So I think when the policymakers in Venezuela design the right framework for investment, they will have to design the appropriate local content framework as well.
Well, as I said, as Antoine said, this study by Professor Monaldi is incredibly timely and very clear and a lot of great information. I hope people will look on our website and take a look at it. And it's teed up well our next event, which will take a little bit broader lens and look at the new and changing geopolitics of energy with a study that we're releasing by Carlos Pascual, who's a non-resident fellow at the Center, the former top energy official of the U.S. State Department. A conversation we'll have with Carlos and then with Ian Kahn, the CEO of Centrica, Michael Levy from the Council on Foreign Relations, and Mona Sutphin, the former White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and that'll be Tuesday evening. Hopefully you can join us. If not, you can always watch online, listen to our events on our podcast, through our website, or on iTunes. Follow us on Twitter at Columbia U Energy, and we look forward to an exciting and productive new academic year. Please join me in thanking our panelists.